Good morning. This is week 5 of the history of the family in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the year has passed since the previous edition of this course, and as you can see, this is exactly 1 year since the first lockdown and when everybody started experimenting with online teaching. The good news is that over this year technology improved quite significantly, and first of all, the Moodle page is up and running. I hope you are all able to access the materials, all the things that I mentioned that the previous edition of the course will be getting in emails. I'm putting these things to the forum space in Moodle. So there is this one forum called Additional Materials for the Study of the 18th Century, and we have the documentaries by Lucy Worsley and Amanda Vickery. There is a radio program about the blue stockings. And there are some more documentaries. The episode of History of Britain by Tony Robinson about the Georgians, so the people in the 18th century, the lives of common people. There is a documentary, 3-part documentary about Britain's slave trade. And there are some interesting materials about the fashion in the 18th century. We are also going to talk about it a little bit today, so I will be adding to the previous year's videos, so you'll have more things here in the videos and on Moodle, rather than leave everything for the live meetings. So I talked last year about the blue stockings, and yes, this was an informal, friendly society for intellectual women. It was actually a mixed society, so men were allowed as well. Men like a philosopher, Edmund Burke, or Dr. Johnson, whom I mentioned earlier. So they would spend time together. The 18th century is quite a good time for the two sexes spending time together on all kinds of parlor games, board games, card games, not necessarily only for gambling. Gambling was quite a widespread vice in the 18th century, but otherwise people just played card games for fun, for sport. But also the salons, that is the places of intellectual discussions, and the art of conversation, the art of the discussion is really something very important and very new, I would say, in the 18th century, especially as it groups men and women together. And one of the leaders of the Blue Stocking Society was a woman called Elizabeth Montagu. Elizabeth Montagu, she was a social reformer, a salon hostess, a literary critic. So she was quite a an influential, you might say, intellectual lady. If you want to know more about her, the radio program is quite advisable here. She, like many women from this group, and among them the lady I already mentioned, Mrs. Piozzi, or Mrs. Srail, later, after her second wedding, called Mrs. Piozzi, were members of this group of friends and intellectuals. So she would have regular parties, regular meetings, in which the invited people would cultivate the art of polite conversation. So the kind of conversation that would be about literature. So also not necessarily literary fiction, which is also a new thing then, but the essays and philosophies. So they would read and then discuss relatively serious matters, or at least I would say more serious topics than a regular group of friends might generally discuss. So some people could be invited, like writers, actors, philosophers, painters. So people like Horace Walpole, the writer, you might say the originator of the Gothic novel in England. Joshua Reynolds, the first president of the Royal Academy of Arts, because this is also the moment when the Royal Academy of Arts is established. David Garrick, one of the greatest actors of this age, mostly specializing in Shakespearean roles, and also lots of ladies. Ladies like Frances Burney, Elizabeth Carter, Margaret Cavendish Harley, Mary Delaney, so the lady I already mentioned as well, Hannah More, another social reformer, Hester Srail, I mentioned already, Anna Williams. So intellectual women who would participate in the, I would say, life of the mind of the day, and the art of the conversation is really the most important thing. So we have the education of women continuing, but moving from the, let's say, social graces, such as music, dancing, perhaps a bit of foreign languages, to more literary education and philosophical education and basically, well, conversation. So this is perhaps a new thing. Of course, the social graces are still there, and a good hostess should be able to dance, perhaps to sing or play a musical instrument, but in the 18th century, with the Enlightenment, we have more emphasis on the written culture rather than the skills, the practical skills. Although the practical skills are never gone, if you remember Mary Delaney and her paper Mosaics, before she came up with this new art, she experimented with all kinds of handicrafts, and this would include embroidery and actually decorating small boxes with some sort of lacquer work. So that's what you would find. So here we have this woman, Elizabeth Montagu, and her role as a leader of the society. So this is something quite new, I would say. Another lady that I would like you to meet has the same surname. They were related through their husbands. The second lady's name is Mary Wortley Montagu. So the name Montagu is the same. As I said, they were both Elizabeth and Mary. They were both married to men who were distant relations. So that's what you have. Mary was slightly older, and that's no, she wasn't. No, she was slightly older. She was born in the last years of the 17th century, and Elizabeth in the beginning of the 18th. Why is Mary Wortley Montagu important? I will leave a very interesting talk about her from the historical channel Reading the Past, which is very enjoyable and interesting. And this woman could be credited with one very important innovation, namely vaccination against smallpox. She was the first person to bring to England the knowledge, the information about an early form of vaccination against smallpox. Smallpox was a contagious disease which was extremely dangerous. The death rate, if you got infected, was more than 30%, so lots of people died, regardless of social classes. There are cases of royalty dying. Actually, one of the stewards, Mary II, the wife of William III, she contracted smallpox and died. And those people who survived very often were left with permanent scars on their skin, on their faces. So this was a very brutal disease, you might say. Mary contracted this disease when she was a teenager. She survived. She had some scars on her face. We will talk a little bit about the fashion in a moment, but this is how she became interested. She knew how difficult and dangerous the disease could be. So when her husband was given the post of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, so modern Turkey, they went there. They went to Constantinople, so modern Istanbul, and she had her first child with her, a little boy named Edward, like her husband, and she heard that local people were performing some sort of medical procedure which sounded rather drastic, because local healers, usually older women, would actually cut or prick with the needle the skin of people who wanted to be vaccinated. It's not like the modern vaccination. Actually, this method was called variolation. The idea was to infect the person you want to immunize with a very small dose of the disease, so they have a let's say lighter version of the disease, and they become immune to any more serious infections. So this woman, this kind of healer, would introduce a little bit of substance from the source of the person who suffered from smallpox. So the child, it was usually performed on children, would be ill for a few days, and if they were lucky, and especially if the dose of the infectious material was right, they would survive, and they wouldn't be scarred, and they would be immune to smallpox later on. This wasn't completely safe. A small percentage of children who were variolated developed the full scale of the disease and died anyway. So this was perhaps a 2% chance, but compared with the 30 or over 30% chance of dying if you got the full version of the disease, this was definitely a risk that many parents believed was worth taking. So Mary Wortley Montagu decided to have her little son variolated, and when she returned with her family to England, and she had another child, a little daughter, she decided to variolate her against smallpox as well, and she made it into a kind of public presentation for the nobility and for the royal family. So you might say she was so sure of the method that she decided to demonstrate the procedure on her own baby daughter. The procedure was successful. The child survived and was immunized, and this was really the first instance when this method that Mary Wortley Montagu learned in Turkey. It was originally from China, but it kind of came from China to Turkey, and then through the ambassador and his wife it came to Britain. This was a massive step forward for medicine. This was actually the starting point for later developments in the research concerning immunization against smallpox and the discovery of the vaccine. The vaccine used a similar disease, a different disease, actually the so-called cowpox. Vacca is Latin for cow. So vaccine used this cow virus, which produced a relatively mild version of the disease, without the scarring, without the threat of death, to have a similar response of the organism. But the original version, the original method, was this Eastern method that was introduced by Mary Wortley Montagu. So this is something quite interesting. In the 18th century, we already start having such massive leaps in medical science. This is, of course, a kind of trial and error, and when the nobility and even the royal family started immunizing their children, there were some casualties. Unfortunately, at least one small child of King George III died after the variolation against smallpox, but his other children, and he had 15, survived and were immune. So this very dangerous disease was perhaps not completely eradicated, but the practice of inoculation really helped to contain it. So that's the extra material about two more important women from the 18th century, and as another, let's say, extra material, I would like to talk with you a little bit about 18th century fashions and dress. So that's it.